Discussions of race and racial inequities can create a lot of discomfort for anyone, but particularly for white people in the US. So, for many white people, having these conversations means confronting very core ideas about how the world works, about their sense of self, about their sense of history. And I can maybe speak to this from my own experience as a white upper middle class woman growing up. I was taught that America is a meritocracy where everyone is equal and has equal opportunities. Uh, I was taught that the racialized history of the US was in the past, right? We had the civil rights movement, and now things are much better. But now I know that racial inequities still exist, that the history of the US was much more violent than I was told, right? And it can be really hard to confront that and to learn these new things. And I think particularly to think about how my own family has benefited from those racial inequities. So, as an example, my grandfather fought in World War II and had access to funds from the GI Bill when he came back, and those were able to help fund his education. And there were many Black Americans that were not able to access institutions of higher ed at that time, and so were not able to benefit in that way. Similarly, my grandfather was able to use some of those funds to buy a house, but many Black Americans, mortgage companies would not lend them money to buy a house, and so they couldn't use those funds in that way either, right? And so it's hard to think that my family really benefited from these, but my grandfather was able to get a better job, was able to build equity in a house. That has economic implications that trickles down across the generations. And so, I mean, I see my family as very hardworking people who deserve success, right? But at the same time, I have to admit that, those successes were not just hard work, but they were also due to access, being able to access higher education. I think it's also really challenging in terms of, again, like sense of self. We want to see ourselves as good people. We want to see ourselves as treating everyone equally, but then that prevents us from realizing the biases that we may have, the things that we might do or say that do perpetuate inequities, right? And so I think that's a huge discomfort in terms of engaging in these sorts of conversations, right? And so, I mean, everyone's different. Everyone has different histories. You know, all white people have not had the same privileges as my family as well. So there are differences there, but I think we have to be honest about the places where there has been an advantage, and where there may be bias and things like that, even if it causes discomfort, because, you know, what's worse than the discomfort is just not engaging in these conversations at all. In terms of addressing inequalities in our context, I think it's important to think about who is or is not being included in whatever narrative. And so I think part of that is being specific in our language, and so not making overgeneralizations. So if I say I'm talking about women, am I talking about all women? Am I just talking about white women? Am I just talking about women from a certain socioeconomic or racial background? Or cis women versus trans women, right? Being specific about who are we talking about, and who is whatever we're saying true for and who is it not. The other thing that I've seen happen a lot of times too is making false equivalencies, right? So I've heard a lot of times people say, well, my relatives came from Ireland or Italy and were discriminated against here. And absolutely, this is a true part of American history. But we just can't make that equivalent to, African American history here, where folks were brought over forcibly and then thrown into slavery. And so we can still say things that are true, but not try to say that it's the same when it really isn't. Professionally, I work with teachers, so I talk to them a lot about setting the tone from the very beginning and saying, as we engage in these conversations, here are some things we really want to be careful about to make sure that we're being inclusive in this conversation. That we're not making these overgeneralizations, that we're not making false equivalencies. And when you do that, when you sort of set the tone and you talk up front about these are things that may happen as we engage in these sorts of conversations, you give people sort of vocabulary to know, how to engage respectfully in these conversations and recognize their own biases and things like that. And it helps to give them practice. And so when these topics come up, even unexpectedly, they have some tools to engage in these sorts of conversations and do so in a nuanced and respectful way. I think a big reason is that we can sometimes get complacent. So we make a process more equitable or we have a more inclusive discussion. Sometimes we feel like, done. I've just shown everyone what a good person I am. I've reached it, done, right? But it's not about sort of one event, one conversation, one idea, right? It's not even about multiple. It's about having an ongoing process where you're thinking about the ways in which things are equitable or inequitable. You're thinking about how you're bringing your own experience, how others have different experiences, those sort of things. And so it's a never-ending process in that way. Another thing related to this is sort of the language of equity. So the language is constantly changing. So it's a process just keeping up with that. Um, this can be a big point of frustration for people, especially if they use, sort of an outdated term and are called out on it. But I think there's often good reasons why the language has changed. And so trying to understand that and move forward and use the updated language and just trying to stay updated in general, I think is important for this work. And then finally, I think one thing that's an ongoing process is just thinking about having conversations across differences. Too often we stay within our own bubbles and don't interact with anyone different from ourselves. And so I think trying to sort of move out of that and to understand different people's perspectives and experiences is really important. And so something like social media can be really good at reinforcing those sorts of things, but it can also be used to move you outside of your own bubble. So think about who you're following. Try to follow some people who have different perspectives than you. Go to news outlets that are for audiences that are not you. So you can begin to understand other people's perspectives. Another thing is just joining groups where there is diversity, right? Where you are going to encounter people who are different than yourself. And even if you're not having conversations there about race or equity more generally, just interacting with people different from yourself, again, really helps you to understand where people are coming from, what their background is like, what their experiences have been like, and how that's similar or different from yourself. And ultimately, it really just helps us see each other as human beings.